Welcome to Design Your Life in Business, the podcast for leaders by Bright Mind Consulting Group. We give you the necessary tools to help you become the architect of not just your business, but your life too. I'm your host, Jevon Wooden. Hey, what's going on, Oliver? Welcome to Design Your Life in Business. How you been?
I'm good, man. It's a big question when you say, how are you? We all just kind of go, yeah, good or not. It's a loaded question, but life's good. I can't complain.
Absolutely, man. Well, I'm glad life is good and you answered that genuinely because, yes, we do glaze over it. It's just like a knee-jerk reaction. Say, yeah, I'm all right. So good. Well, I got another loaded question for you. And that is a question I ask every guest. Who are you? Who is Oliver Yonchev?
Again, you're coming out firing with the big questions.
That's what I do.
We're going soul searching. So I founded, along with Stephen Bartlett, a marketing and communication company called Flight Story. If I go back some time, I'm a failed indie rocker. I started my career as a musician, as a drummer, believe it or not. The cool ones in the group, the noisy ones.
I do like the drummer. The drummers, if I had to choose something, it would have been drums.
Yeah, everybody likes drums until you're in an apartment next to them. Then no one likes you. So I started my career as a musician, went on to do some success, then did that for about 3 years. Failed eventually, didn't quite make it to the heights, but we had a record deal, those types of things. I then went to study music following that. And that led me on a path where I started to discover marketing. I realized that we are all marketing ourselves at any one point, whether that's in a romantic sense, whether that's in business. We're all trying to sell ourselves. And foundationally, I find people fascinating. And that's what marketing is, understanding people and understanding how to connect with them in a meaningful way. So I did that for a few years. I then joined a startup, a social media startup that took me on a crazy trajectory over 5 to 6 years. Eventually, I lived in the US. That company went public in 2019. By the time I exited that business, it was employing 1,200 people. It was turning over about $750 million. And then I started again a year and a half ago with my co-founder, Stephen, and we went again. We're going again, and we're trying to build a very, I'm going to say, delusionally ambitious, industry-changing marketing service business.
Oh, man. So I got so many questions just off of that intro into who you are. First question, got to go back to the music. Are there any correlations between being a drummer or musician in marketing?
I believe creativity is a superpower. I think creativity is something, whether we believe we're creative or not, it's something human beings crave. It's the reason that music is universal. One of my favorite quotes about music is it's the universal language of mankind. Doesn't matter about your background, your history, the language you speak. Music is a thing that can connect us. And I believe that to be true of creativity. And I don't care what discipline or expertise your field is in. I think creativity gives you advantages. If you are, an entrepreneur, if you're an engineer, if you're in marketing, creativity will often fuel. And what music taught me is creativity is often conflated with the wrong thing. We always assume creativity is originality. But for me, creativity is taking inspiration, and we're all inspired from multiple places, and producing new things. And that's the foundation in many cases of entrepreneurship. We're taking inspiration from the way things used to be done, and then you have a vision on how you think it should be done, and you come up with something new. So yes, creativity has given me advantages in marketing. Music, it teaches you a lot about yourself. What I will say, in going through a performative career, you learn to be on stages, you learn to deal with pressure, you socialize with a lot of people, you learn some soft skills that help you in business. So undoubtedly, music shaped who I am and maybe gave me some advantages, particularly when I pursued a more formal career in marketing.
Yeah, and I think that was beautifully stated. Segue into the next question is, as a musician, you are constantly selling yourself. So when you decided to say, hey, I'm going to jump over to marketing because I didn't quite get to where I wanted to go with this career, what did that look like for you? What was the process of jumping in to that social media organization?
The process was one very accidental, if I'm being brutally honest. I just finished our endeavors with our band and I didn't know what to do. Like a lot of people, you have these crossroads in life. And I thought, I know music, I'll go study music. And I went to a university and inadvertently, part of my modules and courses were promotion. It was marketing, it was comms, it was public relations. So I started to get exposed to these disciplines and I was introduced into a world that I didn't really knew existed. So it was never intentional for me to get into marketing. But once I learned about the discipline, I started to have appreciation or an understanding that I'd be marketing the band, I'd be marketing myself. It's something that is a real advantage or certainly a good skill to nurture and understand for the rest of your life. So I started to enjoy it. And once I'd graduated university, I went to work for a large media owner on a formal graduate program. So my segue into entrepreneurship wasn't a straight line. It wasn't like I was selling things in school, and I'm naturally a little more risk adverse. I think entrepreneurs are natural risk takers, so it didn't come as easy to me. But I went into a profession. I found out I was good at it through exposure. And that over time gave me the confidence to take a few more risks with my career. I saw a startup one day that my co-founder founded. I'll tell you the story. I was scrolling down Facebook one day and I saw a TED talk. And the TED talk was entitled How I Built a Multi-Million-Dollar Business Knowing Nothing About Business. Like, perfect. This speaks to me.
That's a good TED Talk title right there.
It speaks to me on so many levels. And actually, I did something I'd never done before. I reached out to Stephen, whose TED Talk it was, and said, I found your story really inspiring. Doing this as a career, keep up the good work. And I actually had no motives other than sending someone some serendipitous appreciation and some love. He reached out and said, hey, we're an ambitious business. We need new people. We're looking for more experienced people. Come have a chat. Went and met him. And then I joined that startup. That was very much in its early days. It had been operating for about a year and a half. But once I joined that business, it was very much a rocket ship of opportunity. And that again took me to the States. I learned a lot through that process of 5 or 6 years. And he exited the business a year before me. And then I exited a year later. And he said, we sat around the table and we're good friends. And he just said, do you want to do something new? And I said, what? What do you want to do? And he went, well, what are we good at? And we just sort of broke down that, what are we good at from our experiences? And we started to build a plan. Wasn't overly thought through, but it was, we're good at these things. Maybe we can form a business around it. We can go again. And that was the trajectory.
Man, there are so many lessons in that. The first lesson, well, we hit on this unsaid thing of resiliency, right? You didn't let that adversity stop you. You could have easily said, like we see so many times, ex-players in sports who say, oh, that was my purpose, that was my passion, and they just go and fall, right? And they stay down. So what kept you going, even though music was your passion and you felt like it was your purpose at one stage in your life? What kept you going past that when you realized that that wasn't it?
I think we all have a misguided relationship with purpose and passion, particularly when you're young. When you're young, you don't know what you want. You're still figuring out your identity, who you are, who you want to become. You're navigating the complexities of life. And for me, I was always orientated. I thought things I liked to do had to be careers. But what I learned through the process of being exposed to new things was a passion for me was a learned behavior. It wasn't something I had. I started to get passionate for business. I started to get passionate for marketing. I started to get passionate for doing advertising. These were all things I grew to love and like and get a lot of fulfillment from. So through that process, I learned passion for me was as much a learned behavior. What I will say is when you go through any process and you receive some success, it's reaffirming, it's confidence building. And actually, if you can find that orientation between something you have some skills or you have a natural inclination for, you align that with a career where you're spending a lot of your time. And suddenly you then, I suppose, are reaffirmed and you become more resilient through that process of being good at something and getting that positive feedback that you get through successes. So yeah, the lessons in my journey, if I reflect back, they weren't always intentional. It was always a byproduct, but I like to try and, as best as I can, be a reflective, self-aware person. So I look back and understand the levers and aspects or experiences I had that helped me become successful in future endeavors. And it was certainly trying to find, I think if I was to give one actionable tip, it was find fulfillment in the process of learning. It's making sure that you're guided by the right goals. I've never been particularly guided by materialistic goals.
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't 100%. I think actually maybe as I've got older, I've become a bit more commercially astute and focused on certain financial goals. But I think for younger people, you go through life, and I think if you orientate around financial goals, I think it can lead you down maybe an unfulfilling path. And as much as life can be short, it's also long. We spend a lot of our lives working. So I think spending some time in your younger years, learning some new skills, creating value within yourself, I think that's a better investment than necessarily chasing the bag from day one, you know?
Yeah, absolutely, man. And I also want to go back because I don't know if you realize it, Oliver, but you're dropping a lot of jewels right now, man, and I appreciate it. So, so another thing you talked about was reaching out to Steven, how you just wanted to let him know that you appreciated that talk that he gave. And it led to this serendipitous moment of now you running multi-million-dollar organizations together. Talk us through that a bit. Once you sent that message and you was like, hey, I just wanted to let him know. You didn't expect anything, right? You just reached out to him to let him know he impacted you. And then you got this message back. What was that like when you seen that he responded, he replied and said, hey, why don't you come work with me?
Yeah, you know, at the time, it wasn't a big deal because I wasn't reaching out for a job. Actually, in my career and domain, it felt like a huge risk joining this startup. I was working in a large organization. I was the top salesperson in this organization. I was earning a lot of money. And this was, in commercial terms, a bit of a step back. But again, because I wasn't orientated by financial goals at that stage in my life, I was more about finding fulfillment, getting better at my craft. I probably didn't realize at the time the significance of that message. But what I will say generally is I think whenever you do the right things for the right reasons consistently, luck tends to work with you and not against you. So for me, my motives were genuinely pure. It was just sending someone some love. And if I do that more times, if we're kind and compassionate and just say nice things to people, I have a funny feeling that the opportunities that feel random, that feel lucky, are probably just a byproduct of doing the right things for the right reasons.
No, that's absolutely true. And I talk a lot about how business is often seen as transactional. And we run into trouble, and we're seeing it now with a lot of organizations. They don't really know what to do now that people aren't really, they're holding onto their purse strings a little tighter, and that relationships are really becoming the currency that matters most here. So in Flight Club, how do you all leverage relationships and that intentional establishment of what you do in connecting with people?
Yeah, so to give you some context, so Flight Story is a marketing and communication company.
I'm sorry, I said Flight Club. I was thinking about Fight Club. I meant Flight Story.
I've said it so many times. I get our name wrong myself all the time. That's the problem with having a familiar sounding brand.
Right.
It's an advantage and a disadvantage.
I didn't even realize it until I was like, wait a minute, I said Flight Club.
We do strategy, content, and media services for a range of clients. We do a lot of consumer tech. We do a lot of big blue chip companies as well. And marketing for me is simply a vehicle to build brands and reputations. It's to help companies grow. And through those two processes, you create value. Part of our process, we are entirely built, or our success is entirely built by our reputation and our connections and our network. We're a B2B business. I tend to, if I was to give it, I suppose, an objective view, and I'll not speak about us because I think it's probably more relevant to any listeners. I think when you start your career or you're earlier on in your career, you're often paid for your time, and then you're paid for what you know, and then you're paid for who you are. Flight Story, what we are doing at the start of our journey is we're trying to amplify our skills and our knowledge. So as a company, we do a lot of content marketing. We don't actually do a lot of networking. Our view is that if we can share our philosophy in the most impactful way at scale, the world will come to us. And that's quite a daunting task because it's hard to attribute. It's something that businesses often fear because the results aren't quick. They don't come immediately, but over time, you're compounding the efforts of putting good ideas into the world, and actually you gravitate the world or people that share similar philosophies and have similar value sets come to you. So that's our marketing philosophy, how we think about ourselves. And I'm not the biggest fan of networking in the traditional sense for that reason, because I think you can achieve the tools we have today. Like this podcast is a medium for you to articulate and connect with people, but broadcast the way you view the world. And through this process, I'm sure you get many great networking experiences. You meet many great people that add value in your life. So I think there's a better, more efficient way to network today, and it's simply broadcasting your authentic ideas to the world through mediums like podcasting, through content and things like that.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, that's what we do over at Bright Mind Consulting Group in large part. There's content marketing as well. Just putting it out, because when people understand what your values are, what you stand on, what your points are, they can relate to you, right? And they can say, okay, this is something I need. This is of value to me. So I also agree with that. And I think you said another key about it taking a longer time. But once you become established, right? Once that catches up and it hits that thing, it's just like a machine, because it's something that you have in perpetuity. That content is always there, right? And you're just building on it as you go forward. So what does that look like for Flight Story as far as putting out content? How many pieces do you look to go to, and what mediums do you typically lean towards?
Yeah, so the way we view our efforts is, I think two things can be true. We try and experiment very quickly. So we put out lots of different formats on a regular basis, but we're also ruthless and we cut formats if the data that guides us tells us it's not working. And we stay very disciplined in areas that provide the greatest return for us. So we are 80% weighted, maybe even more, focused on LinkedIn. All our efforts are on LinkedIn, but our LinkedIn strategy isn't just our own channels, it's our team's channels. So we have about 120 people in the team. We create systems internally to encourage and garner the collective voice of people within the organization through thought leadership, through their own channels. And we create toolkits around our content, meaning when we have big announcements, we make it very easy for everyone in the organization to contribute and share. And that gets us our distribution to the right people across the right networks. So my advice to organizations that are in a B2B or a B2C community, I think it's very important you first start by getting the systems that allow you to create more volume. People underestimate how much content they have to produce in order to get to the right answers. Every answer is slightly different. Everyone has a slightly different brief. Everyone has a slightly different service that they're selling. To get to the right answers, you have to do so much. People underestimate that. So for me, step one, create systems that mean you can scale volume of content efficiently. Step two is ensure you have feedback loops and you analyze that content and make sure you're ruthless with reducing things that aren't working and double down on things that are. And then phase three of that is then expand your channels. So we're a company, we've been around for about 18 months. We've still got a big unlock. We believe we've only just scratched the surface. You said something earlier about the referencing things being harder or taking longer. I think there's something about the world today where we're all looking for shortcuts.
Yes.
And the reality is, if there were shortcuts, they wouldn't provide the returns that we want, right? We only value things that are scarce, that take time, that are hard work. So it would be very audacious for business owners to think there are shortcuts to the really meaningful returns. So for me, we're very aware that our marketing activity has to be disciplined. It has to be focused. It has to be ruthless in terms of experimentation and introducing new things and cutting what isn't working. And that's what we focus on early. But we are transitioning now where we're starting to introduce more formats. And I think for a lot of people, they default to something's not working, so we try a different channel. I think really land one channel and just reiterate till you get a system that's working before being distracted, because the world today is very noisy. Businesses, marketeers, we have so many choices. And actually, a really thoughtful strategy is more about what you don't do than what you do do. So it's really focused helping companies and we're a B2B business. So we advise our clients in the same way we advise ourselves. We act in the world with the same philosophies that we preach to our clients.
Absolutely. And I love what you're saying, man, because yeah, I agree. This is the same way that we operate in my organization. And I believe that a lot of B2B, B2C businesses are really overcomplicating it because they're hearing that noise that you have to be omnipresent. You have to be on every platform. You have to be on YouTube. You have to do this. And I really feel like if you distill it down to what is right for you, then you'll start having the results like Flight Story. You'll realize that, oh, I prefer to write. I prefer to put out long form content. I prefer to really have thoughtful responses. And that will make things a lot less stressful because I'll come in and we work with a lot of people who just stop altogether, right? They're like, you know what? None of this is working. So what is it like for Flight Story when someone comes to you and they're like, hey, we've tried this, and this, and this. What does the process look like for you to say, hold on, we got you?
Yeah, I think first it's making sure you understand the goal. And it's far too many people don't really interrogate the ask. And I'll give you an example. We would historically get a lot of companies come to us and say, I want to grow my following on social media. And we go, okay, but can you tell us what you want? And they're like, we want to grow your following. And I'd say, let me reframe the question. I'd say, what do you do? And they'd be like, we sell shoes. And my response then, okay, so you want to sell more shoes. That's what you want to do. That's your goal. Maybe a social following is a tactic or will contribute to you selling more shoes. But fundamentally, I think it's really important. What we try and do is be the naive voice in the room with an organization and really interrogate how they're thinking. And we try and work then from first principles. Once we've established that and we know what the goals are, we then try and be really pragmatic in how we approach that. I think if you think of what's celebrated in the world today because of social media, we always celebrate the 1%. We celebrate the 1% of talent, the 1% of beauty. We're celebrating the 1% of companies that have the budgets and the authority to do big, crazy, wacky activations. But that's not pragmatic, practical. It's not even effective for 99% of individuals and organizations. So what we try and do is work from foundations, get some really good systems in place, understand what the brief is, and then try and execute in a structured way. And really, to your point around like people try things and they fail, you start this conversation by asking about passion. It's really important that you actually enjoy this process because it's ruthless. It's quite intimidating to put anything out onto the internet. You get feedback, not all of it is good. You can attach your performance and your self-worth to these arbitrary numbers and reach and likes and comments and shares. And it's actually, unless you're doing it for the right reasons and you understand and get fulfillment out of the process, you will probably end up quitting. Businesses will just end up quitting because they're doing it for the wrong reasons. So my advice is try and do it for the right reasons. Make sure you're orientated around the correct goal and have the humility to listen to people. The great thing about the internet, anything I'm saying to you today is not unique, original. It's just a way of doing things. And there are 1,000 other people saying ways of doing things online, right? The information's out there. We all have the answers somewhere. You just got to stay disciplined with executing on the right answers, I suppose.
Yeah. And really, not becoming inundated with all these different ways to do things because there's so much of that information, right? But you mentioned something earlier. You talked about how your team evangelizes the brand. They are ambassadors for Flight Story. And I'm a big proponent of user generated content. So how did you all create that type of culture where people want to evangelize what you have going on over there?
I think it starts with a philosophy internally. So there was a statistic that it was a blind study that was done on organizations that were high performing. And one of the key traits that they had is those organizations were great at communicating. So what I have to do as a leader in the business is I have to communicate that we value people sharing and contributing to our collective success. And then you have to put the reward systems in place And reward systems don't always have to be financial. They have to be like thoughtful. So, when people are contributing a lot to our amplification efforts, I'll pick up the phone and ring them, or I'll send them a voice note and I'll thank them. Like, I think leaders often underestimate how much a simple thank you, and that's reaffirming. Like, as a leadership team, we're all very hands-on around encouraging teams to share messages. And I think beyond that, I think it gets a little harder as you scale at a corporate level because there are sensitivities. I think it'll always start with a philosophical view on the world and just making sure the right incentive structures are in place.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that kind of ties to starting at the beginning, bringing on the right people in the first place. So what does it look like for you all when you're vetting individuals to bring them into what you have built?
It's a great question. Hiring is the most important thing we'll do, and it's probably the most challenging. For me, it starts with being very clear on who you are and who you're not, and being transparent about that. So with Flight Story, we are a very ambitious business. So we have very high expectations. We think a lot like a sports team in terms of our philosophies and values. So when people join us, we'll speak very openly about our expectations, but also we're a business that puts the rewards and the incentives in place for people that can get fulfillment and can really get the most out of an environment like ours. So we speak very openly about that. I think too many companies are afraid to say they try and service everybody. We don't have to be an organizer. We can be an extremely empathetic, an extremely fair, high-performing organizations, but it only starts with us being very clear on who we are. So that's the starting place. And then in terms of hiring, sometimes we get it wrong. And I always think the only times I feel, I suppose, conflicted about hiring the wrong people is if we maybe haven't been as clear up front around who we are and what we stand for and who we want to be in the world. I think if we've done that and we do everything within our power to create the right environment for people to thrive, I'm a big believer in agency. People have choices at that point. But it's a difficult task for all leaders. Finding great people is not easy. And keeping great people and keeping great people motivated is equally as hard.
Yeah. Yeah, you said a word there. You mentioned a feedback systems, and that's one of the best ways to keep people, right? When they feel like they're being heard and valued. So what have you found to be some of the best feedback resources that you leverage within Flight Story?
So there's two parts to this. One of the things we did early in the organization is we created a culture committee. So that's a forum for different people in different territories with different perspectives to come together and basically share things that they feel are important to them. We also have a regular and more comprehensive feedback system in place. We've just onboarded a company called Culture Amp, and that gives an objective standard of employee satisfaction. And that's, I think, around 50 questions, somewhere of that nature, and helps us benchmark how well we're tracking. And then for feedback loops within teams, I think it's really important that you're very clear on what people are measured, their success is measured against. So we have two performance metrics. We have things that are very specific to the role, and we make sure that managers are having regular feedback on a monthly and quarterly basis with people and working towards those goals. And then we also have a set of KPIs that are demonstrating our company values, which is, again, a little more subjective, but then that gives agency to all the team to sort of showcase, here's how I've been experimenting. Here's how I, week to week, try and improve my work 1%. And what we're very clear on then is just making sure that it's an agreement in principle. If you're performing on all metrics, you're very clear on what comes next, what your progression looks like, those types of things. And because we're a startup, we don't get that perfect. We have much greater ambitions with how we set out the infrastructure. Startups, it's spinning so many plates.
Absolutely.
But I think feedback loops all start with creating an environment where people feel safe to share. And it's really interesting. I watched a video on, I think it was Dave Portnoy doing an interview about Barstool. And Barstool's known for having a bit of some would argue, a toxic culture and in terms of how they do things. But he said something on an interview which I really respected. And he just said, I'm the type of person that will tell you the truth, and I may swear to your face. Not that I agree with this, but he would say, I expect it back. And I'll operate in an environment, and this is on the extreme of radical candor, where he'll create an environment where people, I don't believe that to be necessarily the right thing for most organizations. I think it's a bit hyperbolic and a bit extreme of the spectrum, but there is wisdom in the idea of creating a space that is willing to accept radical candor and creating safe spaces for people to do that where they don't feel judged. I think that's important.
Yeah, absolutely. And we hear a lot about, how culturally just the world in general has become soft. And you can't say certain things that you used to be able to say. But then there's also being able to say things in a way that isn't so harsh, but still gets the point across. So how do you create that environment of psychological safety where your people do feel like they can share ideas, share their thoughts on what's going on within Flight Story?
Yeah, so I have a mantra that is, the truth is never unkind. The way you say it can be. And that's something that we try as a management team, all try and instill. So if I tell you something, I'm very selective over the battles I choose. And with feedback, whenever you're communicating, it's so important that feedback is balanced. Human beings have a habit, more broadly, of just pointing out the negative stuff. I'm unhappy with this. This isn't good enough. This isn't good enough. That culture or that feedback will fall on deaf ears if it isn't tapered with, you've done something great today. We have to put as much emphasis on kindness and positive feedback as we do negative. And I think I'm very vocal to our management teams to do that. In a practical way, one of the things that I think is really important, I will never give very direct, harsh feedback in a group setting because I don't want anyone to feel judged. I will always do that privately, but I will always do that. In group settings, we try and keep feedback either positive, celebratory, or very constructive. So my advice is if you're a manager and you're broadcasting anything in a group, even negative things, it always has to be deeply constructive and never pointed at an individual. It's about, as a team, we are behaving in this way. This is not good enough for these reasons. This is how we get better. In a direct setting, you can practice much greater candor. And I think if you create just those two systems, I think organizations will operate or function in a much healthier manner.
Absolutely. Yeah. I love that, man. That's one of the things I learned in the military as a leader is like the only person I am going to put on a chopping block in front of everyone is myself, right? I will say my bad for myself, right? But I would never do that to someone else. So I love that. All right. Well, I can talk to you all day, man, because I love your insight. I love your approach and your thoughtfulness and your responses. But I know you got things to do. So I'm going to go to the by design segment where I ask every guest the same 3 questions. Are you ready?
Okay, fire.
Let's go. Let's go. All right. First question is, what has been the hardest part about designing a life and business you don't need a vacation from?
The hardest part has been figuring out what life I want to live. I think for a lot of people, I spent maybe a decade truly understanding what I'm good at, and I'm still trying to figure that out. And now, as I transition in this next period of my career and professional endeavors, is focusing more on those things. But that took me a decade to figure that out. And then I would say tapering ambition. I think ambition is a curse at times. You're always in the future. You're always looking ahead. And you sometimes miss the special moments. I think you're sometimes missing out on the joys of being present. So I think that's been challenging, is tapering, being present and focused in today, but also thinking about tomorrow. They're probably the 2 things that stand out to me that have been most challenging. And I continue and probably will continue to grapple with those things.
Absolutely, man. Beautifully stated. Number 2, what has been the best lesson you've learned on your entrepreneurial journey?
Best lesson? Wow, that is a big question.
I'm back with those big questions, man.
Yeah, on an entrepreneurial journey, the strongest, probably most applicable for most people, is understanding that all companies are recruitment companies. Your success will be defined by the caliber of people that you can attract to join you, by your ability to retain and inspire and motivate and get the most out of those people. And that is very difficult to do. It requires you putting extreme emphasis on culture, being very intentional, often to the detriment of short-term commercial success. You have to make investments in your people. But long-term, I think it's a winning strategy. So that for me has been the strongest bit of wisdom, understanding that all companies, no matter what sector you're in, you're not a tech company, you're not a marketing company, you're not a service business, you're not an engineering business, you are a recruitment company. And when you understand that, you will behave and prioritize different things.
Okay. Number 3, what are 3 tools or tips that you'd recommend when scaling a business?
Number 1, set very clear goals. It's important that you have long-term goals, you have big ambitions, and you have micro goals, meaning on a quarterly basis, you have 1 to 3 things that you're focusing on. Number 2, I think communication and language matters. Be very intentional with your language and make sure that you over-communicate your vision, what you're doing, why you're doing it, your decision-making process. I think communication will give you many advantages. And the third one, I will say, is I have a view that you only have to be good at one thing in year 1. Just get good at one thing. In year 2, you can get really good at 2 things. In year 3, get good at 3 things. By the time you're 20 years in your Amazon, you can be good at 20 things. But you only actually have to be good at one thing to be very successful. And when you understand that and you truly understand that, I think it's a real big unlock, not just of the mind, but how you behave.
Absolutely, man. This has been an amazing conversation, Oliver, and I can definitely see why Flight Story is ascending to the levels it is and why you have already positioned yourself to sell a multi-million-dollar organization, man. So I'm sure a lot of the designers listening would love to connect with you. What's the best way for them to do so?
I'm very active on LinkedIn, so Oliver Yonchev, but just across all socials at Oliver Yonchev. Best way to shoot me a DM.
Absolutely, absolutely. All right, man. Wishing you much success as you continue to take Flight Story to the next level. And I look forward to speaking with you soon, man. And remember, designers, keep ascending. Design Your Life in Business, the podcast for leaders, is brought to you by Bright Mind Consulting Group. To find out more about Bright Mind Consulting Group and how you can become the best leader possible, visit brightmindconsultinggroup.com. Make sure you search for Design Your Life in Business on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or anywhere else podcasts are found. Click subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. On behalf of the team here at Bright Mind Consulting Group, we cannot thank you enough for listening.